Okay, well, welcome to the March 2022 edition of Outline. My name is Trevor Ivory. I'm the UK Head of Planning here at DLA Piper. I'm joined today to talk about the topic of first homes by a couple of my colleagues. Firstly, her debut for Outline and one of the newest recruits to the DLA planning team is Johanne Ward. So Jo, welcome to you.
Thank you. Good morning.
And also Pieter Claussen, who is a senior associate in the planning team and has done many of these. You're an old hand, Peter, so welcome back.
Thanks, Trevor.
So today we wanted to talk about first homes today. It's a concept that's been with us in policy for a little while now, but Monday was a critical day in the life of first homes, as we'll come on to discuss in a little bit. The transitional provisions decision taking came to an end, and the policy is now very much with us. So we thought it was a timely opportunity to look at what first homes are, but then more importantly look at some of the issues that we think ought to be borne in mind and may well need to be tackled as we move forward and see increasing emphasis perhaps on the inclusion of first homes within developments, within affordable housing provision, and particularly within Section 106 agreements. So Jo, as the new kid on the block, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, please. Perhaps could I just ask you to just briefly remind us all what are first homes? What's the regime that we've got set out in government policy?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Trevor. Well, First Homes is the new government initiative in respect of affordable homes. It aims to provide 25% of all affordable housing units delivered by developers through planning obligations. So some of you may remember Starter Homes, which was a previous government initiative. Now that offered a first-time buyer under the age of 40 a discount of at least 20% below open market value. And with Starter Homes, there were restrictions that were put in place to ensure that these homes were not resold or let at their open market value for 5 years following the initial sale. So First Homes goes a bit further than that. They're newly built properties for first-time buyers, but there's no age stipulation. And they offer a minimum discount of 30% against market value. Now, local authorities and neighbourhood planning groups, they can at their discretion increase the discount to 40% or even 50%, but if they need to demonstrate that there's a need for this. So these percentages, they represent the minimum discount required in order for a home to qualify as a first home. Now, developers are free to offer higher discounts, but the local authority can't make them do so. And it's important to note that these minimum discounts, they should apply to the entire local plan area, except if neighbourhood plans are in place in certain areas, and they shouldn't be changed on a site-by-site basis. Now, after the discount has been applied, whether it be the 30, 40 or 50%, the first sale price must be no higher than 250,000, or in Greater London that rises to £420,000. And local authorities are not allowed to set price caps that are higher than these national caps. Now, first homes need to be of the same type and quality as the equivalent market homes on the development, so they shouldn't stand out. They should meet the same standards as the other properties. They should look exactly the same, and developers should obtain a valuation from an independent registered valuer, and that valuation should accord with the RICS book valuation guidance for new build homes. Purchasers of first homes should have a combined annual household income not exceeding £80,000 per annum, or in the case of Greater London, it's £90,000, and that should be in the tax year immediately preceding the year of purchase. The other thing is that they can't be cash buyers, so a purchaser should have a mortgage or a home purchase plan in place to fund at least 50% of the discounted purchase price. So that's them in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jo. And there are some quite significant restrictions, aren't there, on subsequent sales as well, I think.
Yeah, the First Homes Initiative, it ensures that the discount is secured by a Section 106 agreement. So this needs to be between the developer and the local authority. And it's also noted on the title as a restriction. And the Section 106 agreement specifies the percentage discount that was applied on the initial sale. And then this is applied to all future sales.
And I think for me, Joe, you just mentioned there when you were talking, you mentioned starter homes, and it sort of seems to me first homes are the child of starter homes, perhaps. But I think that there's a key difference between the starter homes that never quite happened and the first homes which are now happening. And that key difference for me is that starter homes were enshrined in legislation, and there was legal effect to the starter homes regime. In contrast, first homes are entirely as a result of government policy, initially a written ministerial statement, and now the PPG that we have that sets out how first home should work. And I think for me, it's an important distinction to keep in mind, because it seems to me it's going to be relevant at certain points during the discussion we're about to have, is that difference between a legal requirement and a policy, national policy requirement set down by the government. But just before we get there and start to look at how it's going to apply to determination of planning applications, Peter, I just wanted to briefly look at the impact for plan making around first homes. The PPG has something to say, doesn't it, about how first homes should be reflected in plan making moving forward?
Yeah, it does, Trevor. And essentially, the PPG says that the plans should set out the affordable housing contributions expected from development, including setting out the levels and types of affordable housing provision required. Now, obviously, none of that is unfamiliar, but I think that the key change is that plans are now expected to include policies for first homes. And critically, and Joe alluded to it earlier, those policies should require that a minimum of 25% of all affordable housing units, which are to be secured through these developer contributions, should be first homes. As you said, Trevor, it's a point that we're going to come back to later when we consider the status of the guidance which introduces the first homes. But I think it's worth noting just now, paragraph 35 of the MPPF, which provides that when plans are going through the plan making process, they'll only be considered sound if, amongst other things, they're consistent with national policy. So on the face of it, there's at least an argument that plans will no longer be considered sound if they fail to take account of first homes.
So in the longer term, ultimately, this is going to be incorporated. We would expect into local plans, and we'll start to see it being part of policy. But that there are some transitional even. Sorry, it's still only 10 o'clock in the morning. There are some transitional provisions for plan making, aren't there, Joe, that mean that doesn't quite bite.
Yeah,
for all plans.
There was a First Homes written ministerial statement back in May last year on the 24th, and it said that local plans and neighbourhood plans that had reached advanced stages of preparation will benefit from transitional arrangements. So local plans and neighbourhood plans that had been submitted for examination before the 28th of June last year, or that had reached publication stage by that date, that's the 28th of June last year, and then subsequently submitted for examination by the 28th of December 2021, they won't be required to reflect the first homes policy requirement.
I think it's quite interesting, isn't it, Joe, that exemption only applies when a plan's been adopted under the transitional arrangements. So you could actually have a rather a niche situation whereby a plan has no provision for first homes in making its way through that adoption process. But until the time it's adopted, there's an expectation that relevant authority will actually be delivering first homes.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. When you look at the PPG, it's quite clear that the exemption applies to a plan that's governed by those transitional provisions, but which has been adopted. So whilst the plan is making its way through that examination process pre-adoption, you're absolutely right, Peter, as I read it, that those transitional provisions don't apply. And so first homes as a policy sits there and needs to be considered in the decision-making process on planning applications, which is slightly odd because then the plan will be adopted and then you won't have to consider first homes until the plan gets reviewed. It's
so quite
first homes on, first homes off, and then first homes
Yeah.
back again in a few years' time when they do it all again. That's the policy equivalent of the okey cokey, perhaps. Well, great, thank you. So in the meantime, we have this sort of slightly odd period where it's not going to be reflected in most plans, I would have thought, as at today, but where the policy is there now in national guidance. And so moving into decision taking and determination of planning applications, there were some transitional provisions that applied to decision taking from the date of the written ministerial statement last year. But as I said in my introduction, that those transition arrangements came to an end effectively on Monday. So as of Monday, determinations that are being made on individual planning applications, other than with that caveat of the transitional provision for plan making, need to be taken into account as a material consideration, part of government policy that is first home. So it's biting as of now. That's hence the timing of us talking about it now. Now, I think it seems to me first homes, as ever, when new tenures of affordable housing are introduced, these can be controversial, and it's particularly, it seems to me, that there's some controversy when it's home ownership rather than affordable and social rent type of delivery of affordable housing. And that can come for a number of reasons. I think some planning authorities will have a political preference for rented models of affordable housing. Others, it may be more about the identified needs. Most planning authorities will have certain needs that have been identified through their SHMAs, their strategic housing market assessments. And actually some authorities then carry those need requirements through from the SHMA into their local plans. And they may even have some quite prescriptive mixes for affordable housing set out in development plan policy. And so I think that's where really we come to the crux of that distinction I made at the outset between law and policy, because we are going to find planning authorities who either just don't like it and are reluctant to do it, or don't think that it's meeting a need that they have, the need that they have in their area, or we may actually find it's in outright conflict with some development plan policies. So I suppose, Peter, I'm going to come to you first. Where do we stand on all of this? I can hear the numbers 38.6 winging their way to the screen very shortly. But what's your take on all of that? How do we begin to unpick it?
Quite, Trevor. But I think it's probably worth noting that the Secretary of State has form for making changes to policy through the use of a written ministerial statement. In the West Berkshire case back in 2016, the content of that statement went all the way to the Court of Appeal. And the statement at the heart of the West Berkshire case had been published in, I think it's 2014, and essentially advised decision makers not to seek affordable housing obligations on schemes of fewer than 10 units. And that was subject to a 1,000 square metre of floor space threshold. But as is the case with what we're seeing now with first homes, the changes proposed by the written ministerial statement were introduced through an amendment to the NPPG. And that statement was initially overturned in the High Court following a legal challenge brought by, it was West Berkshire and Reading councils, but ultimately upheld by the Court of Appeal in 2016. And the Court of Appeal held that the written ministerial statement was lawful and was therefore an up-to-date material planning consideration, which was supported and emphasised in the PPG. And so, as a consequence, it's a matter for the local planning authority, or indeed an inspector on appeal, as to what weight should be attached to the written ministerial statement. Now bringing it back to 38.6, of course, when we're talking about planning considerations, we are doing so in the context of Section 38.6 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, which requires that decisions under the Planning Act should be made in accordance with the plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So essentially what we're dealing with in the West Berkshire case, and what we're dealing with again here with first homes, is a material consideration which needs to be weighed in the planning balance.
it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because when you read the policy is quite sort of absolute. You will do this. 25% of affordable units will be first homes. But I entirely agree with you. I think West Berkshire, there's real similarities between the written ministerial statement and the changes to the guidance that the Secretary of State made in that case. And I think the result has to be the same. Section 38(6) is the legal basis for the determination of a planning application, and policy can't upset that. We've seen that many times around presumptions in favour of sustainable development and all of that. They're all material considerations, but they're not a change to that legal basis. And that would have been very different with starter homes, where there was a legal requirement to deliver it, and that legal requirement would have trumped a policy requirement in a development plan. But I completely agree. I think here what we need to recognise is it isn't an absolute right, and I think for me, developers and landowners shouldn't be assuming that they're going to automatically get 25% of affordable houses as first homes, because it's not as simple as that. Planning authorities may well take a different approach, as was the case in West Berkshire. And I think probably another example of that would be in the build-to-rent sector, where we have some quite clear policies now set out in the framework and the guidance around how affordable housing should look in the context of a build-to-rent scheme. But certainly my experience is more often than not, planning authorities are not using that policy approach to affordable housing. They have their own approach to how they want to secure affordable housing in the context of build to rent, and they still look to see that carried through. So there's clearly discussions to be had on there.
Absolutely, yeah.
I suppose that kind of makes me start to think, so okay, if you find yourself in a situation as a landowner, as a developer looking to bring forward development where you want first homes, and I suspect there are a number of reasons why first homes may well be attractive, particularly around where viability is a challenge. I suspect there may well be a more attractive value proposition in terms of first homes rather than particularly some of the rented forms of tenure. So if you're faced with a situation where you're wanting to deliver those first homes, and you're facing a planning authority that is resisting for whatever reason, I guess, Peter, that there's always the option of an appeal.
Yeah, I think that's right, Trevor. I think if a developer really wants to be pushing for first homes, and the local planning authority doesn't want them, then there does need to be half an eye on an appeal. I think, because obviously an appeal is made to the Secretary of State, you can probably safely assume that inspectors are likely to be applying greater weight to the Secretary of State's guidance. But I must say that even an appeal doesn't come without a health warning, but particularly because, and I think we'll probably come on to it in a second, but this is only guidance. It's not a new policy, and actually there is recent case law that tells us that you should be affording less weight to planning guidance beneath that planning policy, which is interesting, I think, since West Berkshire, because West Berkshire actually, whilst it was the same situation that we've got here, and you're looking at guidance, the West Berkshire case referred in a number of places to as though that guidance was policy. But obviously, Trevor, we've had a couple of cases since West Berkshire which indicate that we're not supposed to give the same weight to the guidance as we are policy.
Absolutely, and you've beaten me to my next question, because I think that for me, that's the second important point. So point number one is this: it isn't a legal requirement. We've still got to start with the primacy of the development plan, and this is just, if I can say, just a material consideration that weight will be attached to. Just before I come on to that, I think on the appeal point, it seems to me that ultimately this is about planning judgment, and a decision maker, whether it's a planning committee or an inspector on appeal, is going to have to decide what weight to attach to that government policy, and decide whether that outweighs any conflict with the development plan that results. And I suppose on an appeal, as a general rule of thumb, inspectors are making decisions in the name of the Secretary of State. They tend to as a result, put more weight, perhaps, in most situations. They tend to put more weight on government's policy, their boss's policy, if you like, than perhaps a local authority who is more invested in their own local plan and in their own political agenda and so forth. So but you're right. At the end of the day, there is still that. It depends on the particular inspector on the particular day how they're going to ascribe weight to the various factors that will inform that decision, won't it?
Yeah, indeed. And I think if we cast our mind back to there was a line of appeal decisions after the West Berkshire case in Richmond Council, and Richmond successfully argued in that case that because of a severe under provision of affordable housing in Richmond, it should be entitled to ignore the small sites exemption and require affordable housing. Now that there was some controversy around the Richmond cases, because when I say it was successful, it was also unsuccessful because it had 5 simultaneous appeals, 3 of which it won and 2 of which it lost. So I think it again goes back to that planning inspectors applying weight and essentially on different sides on the section 38.6 test.
Yeah, good old planning judgment.
Yeah, indeed.
Which, as long as it's exercised in a reasonable way, not an irrational, what we lawyers would call Wednesbury unreasonable way, that's it's unimpeachable, even if 2 decision makers come to completely different conclusions on essentially the same point. That's the game of planning, isn't it? That's the public lawmaking function in action. But I think coming on to that second point then that you just alluded to, Peter, because I think it's a really interesting point. The written ministerial statement talks about first homes as being government policy, but actually no changes have been made to the framework, to the NPPF itself. There's no mention of first homes in that. Where this is set out is in the written ministerial statement itself, and the more practical application of it is in the PPG, which there's a clue in the title. You have the National Planning Policy Framework, and then you have National Planning Practice Guidance. And I think you're right. In West Berkshire, that point didn't seem to be argued, and the court didn't consider whether there's a distinction between policy and guidance. But we have seen those cases since. So can you just talk us through, perhaps, Peter, a little bit more about what those cases were saying on that point?
Yeah, so the first one was the solo retail case, and the issues in that one all turned around the council's approach to a retail impact assessment, and in particular the case for solo wasn't that the NPPF or the local planning policy hadn't been followed, but that the guidance on retail impact assessment in the PPG hadn't been applied correctly. And effectively what we had there was the local plan policy in the NPPF simply saying that there was a need for a retail assessment, and then the PPG perhaps going into a bit more guidance as to what that impact assessment should contain. But actually that it was Justice Liven and made some really I think important points in the comparison or sort of the differentials between policy and guidance, and the judge there found that the PPG is intended as guidance rather than a definitive statement of government policy, and as such it's a less formal document than the NPPF, and should be read in that context. It's not subject to the external scrutiny in the same way that the NPPF is, and actually it was acknowledged as well by the judge in that case that the NPPG, as it has here with first homes and as it did before with the small housing sites exemption, that it can and sometimes change with very little forewarning. So that was the first judgment to consider it, but I don't think it was quite as clinical as what we then got in actually last year in the case of White Waltham Airfield, where Justice Lang held that where a claimant was seeking to elevate the PPG into a binding code, effectively, which prescribed the steps a local planning authority must follow when undertaking its assessment. And Justice Lang said that that's a mistaken approach. The PPG is merely guidance intended to support the policies in the NPPF, but certainly not to be read as its equal.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I sort of chuckled to myself as you said that the judge had recognised that the PPG can change without notice. It always seems to change at about 1 a.m. in the morning. You go to bed thinking you know how the system works. You wake up in the morning, the rules have changed. And if you're not careful, you've missed it. So I think there's a lot in that, and it feels to me that's picking up on the way that we approach the development plan, actually drawing that distinction between policy and guidance. It makes me think of the Cherkley and Mole Valley case a few years back, which was looking at what we mean when we say compliance with the development plan. And the point that the court was making there was there is a distinction to be drawn between the policies of the plan and the supporting text. And ultimately, if you're assessing compliance with the plan for the purposes of section 38.6, you're assessing compliance with policies. The supporting text can help to interpret those policies, it can help to explain the context for those policies. But what the court there was saying very clearly was the supporting text can't add additional requirements that aren't contained in the policy. So in that case, what the court was saying was if the development complies with the policies of the plan, the fact that it doesn't comply with a paragraph of the supporting text can't lead to a conclusion that it's in conflict with the plan, because the policies have a special status. And that feels as if that's almost the direction these more recent cases that are post-Berkshire are saying, is there is a difference in weight perhaps to be attached to a policy that's set out in the framework versus a policy set out in guidance. So it feels as if there's almost a little bit more of a weakening potentially happening there. It's not law, so therefore it's just a material consideration to attach weight to, and arguably it may attract less weight because it's guidance rather than policy. So these are all issues that I think are going to come out in negotiations with planning authorities, aren't they?
Yeah, and possibly on appeal too, and to how much weight is going to be applied when inspectors are making decisions. So it's probably worth developers having half an eye on that too, that it perhaps does have less weight than if it was policy.
Just completely lost track, having looked out the window on the 31st of March in Birmingham, and it's absolutely snowing like crazy outside the window. My word, that's not what I was expecting in the weather today. So we're moving on, looking at some of the other practicalities of this then, and we've got a few questions which we'll come back to and pick up at the end, if I may. But I want to look at kind of actually some of the detail of this, and Joe, sort of turning to you, you have the advantage. You were quite heavily involved with the pilot projects around delivery of first homes that happened about a year or so ago, wasn't it? And you were involved in the negotiation of some of those Section 106 agreements. We've got the model provisions now as part of the PPG. The government's published sort of model template provisions that can, in theory, be picked up and dropped into a Section 106 agreement without requiring any negotiation. And I think the reason we have those is probably off the back of the experience that you were part of, which was the devil was, as so often the case, in the detail of trying to negotiate some of those provisions with planning authorities, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they've obviously set out the model provisions within the PPG that can be adopted, but there are options for local authorities contained within those model provisions. So a local authority can set a local connection and a local eligibility criteria. So that's on top of the national eligibility on first-time buyers and price their wages and everything. They can set local connections. They can set whether they should be key workers, so they can prioritize people with on their employment status, their local connection to the borough. And if they decide to prioritize key workers, and that's however they decide to define them, so long as they've identified a local need for certain professions, certain jobs, they can do so. So the Section 106 agreement itself, it notes that the local authority is responsible for setting any additional local criteria. But these criteria, the local criteria, can only apply for the first 3 months of any resale. If a purchaser is not found within those 3 months, then the eligibility criteria reverts back to the national criteria. So when I was involved in negotiating some of the Section 106s in the pilot schemes last year, there were a couple of local authorities that I can remember were quite happy to just go with the national criteria. They didn't want to add anything on, but there were others. There was one particular I can recall insisted that anybody applying should have lived in the area consecutively for 36 months or be tied to somebody who lived in the area. They should, the others identified key workers such as emergency workers, those in the health service. There were some that prioritised childcare, education, and I can recall somebody, there was even a provision that they could, a key worker could be classed as a supermarket worker, because at that time we were obviously coming through COVID, and people had suddenly recognised the job that people on the tills and the delivery drivers were doing. Now there is an exemption from any local connection criteria which applies to members of the active members of the armed forces. It also applies to any divorced or separated spouses of armed forces, or anybody who's lost somebody serving in the armed forces, and also veterans within 5 years. So they're quite keen, to make sure that our armed forces are catered for in these first homes.
Yeah. And it seems to me, Peter, that probably a similar point to the one you were making about whether first homes are going to be acceptable to planning authorities or not. It sort of applies to the detailed drafting in the model provisions as well. And Joe touched on the local eligibility criteria as one that that a number of authorities during the pilot were very, very concerned about. And that resonates, I suspect, particularly in rural areas. We'll all have had experience of authorities who are very keen to try and make sure that affordable housing is made available, for very good reasons, made available to those with those local connections. Yeah. But the limitations that are placed on that in the model drafting, the 3 months that Joe was talking about, it seems to me, Peter, that's not written in stone either, is it? That's still going to have to be negotiated with a planning authority who may take a different view and may want a more stringent approach that raises issues of itself, won't it?
I think it does, and actually having reviewed the drafting, it lends itself to diverting away from the drafting, I think anyway, because unless you're going to have a solely first home Section 106 agreement, then you're going to need to cover off other types of affordable housing tenures, which simply from a drafting and simplicity context means that you'll need to amalgamate certain definitions so that they don't make the document unnecessarily clunky. And actually, I think local authorities are not wanting to stick to the model drafting, then for the reasons we've said earlier, I think they've probably got good grounds to do so, because it is only guidance. And that has to be weighed in the planning balance. And if an authority doesn't want to give as much weight to what the drafting looks like, then there is going to be an argument.
Yeah, and that, as we all know, the Section 106, even a simple Section 106 can become incredibly protracted, with local authorities quite often wedded to their standard approach, regardless of whether the standard approach actually works on the particular site. But even relatively simple negotiations can add quite considerably to the length of time it takes to get to a commission. And ultimately, there's a limit to what you can do, because unless you're actually prepared to go to an appeal and argue about terms of a Section 106, you've got to you've got to come to an agreement with a local authority. There's quite often less incentive on them to compromise and negotiate than there is the applicant for planning permission to the landowner. And I think all of that, particularly in those early days, as people are getting used to this, as local authorities are finding their own way of delivering first homes and things, it feels like there's some real potential there for some quite difficult discussions and negotiations around what the detail of the first homes provision is going to look like, isn't there?
I think that's right, and I think there are provisions in there, even in the draft, in the guidance drafting, that local authorities will want to change, because you've got one part of the drafting effectively provides that if the developer's not able to dispose of a first home to an eligible purchaser over a 6-month period, and then the local authority doesn't then want to purchase the home, the developer's to pay 30% of the proceeds of sale to the council. Now, I suspect rather than having that 30%, which is something they can't necessarily do an awful lot with, they'd probably rather be securing other forms of affordable housing at the site rather than just moving away from it. So I'd expect that to be a point of negotiation from the outset.
So we've had a couple of questions come through in the chat box. The first one is a tricky one, actually. So the first one is asking the question, as part of the protections that go into the 106 to ensure that first homes remain as the discount is captured on subsequent sales, there's a restriction on title, and that restriction on title, the way it's envisaged under the policy arrangements, is that the planning authority will sign off on a sale to confirm that the requirements of the first homes arrangements have been complied with. The question that's been asked is, what happens if you're dealing with this on a unilateral? I suppose that appeal would be a classic example. If you're on appeal, and if you're delivering this through a unilateral Section 106 undertaking rather than a Section 106 agreement, the key there from a legal perspective being you can't, through a unilateral undertaking, impose obligations on the planning authority. So you can't necessarily deliver the planning authority signing off under a restriction on title. So what do you do with that restriction on title? How do you make it work? And I think, I'm not sure I know the answer. My sort of best guess, and I'll throw it out to you two if you've got any better ideas, but my sort of best guess is you'd have to look at a more unilateral mechanism where perhaps you're getting the solicitor acting for the seller, having to certify that the arrangements and the requirements of the Section 106 have been complied with. Now, whether a conveyancer is going to want to do that, whether they're going to want to put their practicing certificate on the line, certifying something that might be a little bit vague and a little bit nebulous, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's an easy solution. But if there's going to be that restriction on title, I certainly, off the top of my head, as that question's come in, I can't immediately see an easier solution than that, unless either of you can. I'm getting shakes of the head.
No, I don't think, because as you said, with the unilateral, you can't place an obligation on the authority to do anything. So the best you can do, I suppose, is do as much as you can from your side, and then I suppose hope that the council then removes the restriction.
I've certainly seen that sort of mechanism done. I'm thinking where this sort of comes up, you sometimes see this, not so much these days, but historically with agricultural worker restrictions on properties, you sometimes see a restriction on title. Equally, I've seen, particularly in rural authorities where council housing has been sold off, you sometimes see restrictions on title there. Largely gone these days, but there was a while where local authorities were imposing restrictions so that future sales needed to be to local occupants. So a very similar scenario there with local eligibility criteria, effectively. And certainly those where I've seen it done unilaterally, the onus has fallen on the solicitor acting for the seller to have to certify that the requirements of the 106 or the requirements, whatever the legal instrument is that's imposed the obligation, have been complied with. So I think it can work, but to use this phrase already today, but the devil will be in the detail of quite what it is that the solicitor acting is able to certify, given that certification for solicitors, as the three of us all know, is quite a big thing. If you get that wrong, your practicing certificate's gone and your career is over. So we don't tend to take risks when we're asked to certify things, do we? As professionals, it's more than our job's worth, quite literally. So there's hopefully a bit of an answer there, but not necessarily a wholly satisfactory one. I appreciate. The second question, I think, is a little bit more straightforward to answer, which is, once you've provided your 25% of your affordable housing requirement as first homes, what happens in terms of the percentages for the other tenures after that? And I think I'm right. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. I think I'm right in saying that the answer is broadly the other tenures would follow whatever the percentage would have been, but effectively it's Joe's nodding away. You've done this more than me, Joe. So I think that's right, isn't it? You effectively take the 25% out, and then you carve up the remainder of the affordable housing in the same percentages?
Yeah, they have done some worked examples in the PPG. But that's basically the way it works. Yeah.
There's an interesting point there, it seems to me, though, in terms of the relationship between first homes and the NPPF requirement for 10% of new dwellings to be affordable home ownership products as opposed to affordable rented products. And the guidance, the PPG does deal with that as well. And the PPG gives some worked examples, and they make the point that from a national policy perspective, if your 25% first home provision doesn't, so that's, sorry, let me be clear, if your 25% of your affordable housing requirement doesn't equal 10% of the total number of units being built on the site, then you should still top up with other forms of affordable home ownership, or indeed with more first homes, presumably, to get to that 10% policy requirement, and then deliver the affordable rented and other models in proportion. So I think that there's a complexity there if the NPPF 10% affordable home ownership policy is also being applied. There's that slight technicality, but otherwise that's the answer, isn't it? Is you divide the rest up as you would have done, but just exclude the 25% first homes. Great. I'm just checking to make sure we haven't had any more questions come in, and we haven't. So we're running nicely to time for once, and it stopped snowing. Update on the weather from Birmingham. The sun is out now and the snow is finished. So hopefully spring can continue relatively soon. But just if I can just sort of try and bring all that together, what's the big takeaway from this for you both? And Joe, you're our newbie, so I'm going to come to you first. So that Peter doesn't get the chance to steal your good idea. But what's the takeaway that you would say for anyone looking to bring forward planning applications around first homes?
Well, I think we've touched on it already. Is that, you know, negotiations over the Section 106 could be lengthy with the local authority, depending on what their ideas are. It might be a good idea to establish early on if they have a local eligibility criteria, or if they're likely to put one in place, because I know we found in the past that different people at the authority had different ideas and they didn't always agree. So it did become quite lengthy, because you could, you know, your pool of buyers eligible to buy first homes could be quite small initially if they're going to really tie it down to certain people. So I think, you know, be prepared to negotiate and factor that time in. That's mine.
A very good practical point. Don't assume it's as easy as the model provisions suggest it's going to be. Yeah, good point. So Peter, I don't know whether Joe stole yours or not, but hopefully you've thought on your feet if she has. What would be your takeaway from today's session?
No, actually, it's the first time I've done one of these where it hasn't been stolen. So for me, it still all comes down to Section 38.6. We've got a new material consideration to be weighed in the planning balance.
It starts with Section 38.6 and it should always end with Section 38.6. As everyone that's ever worked with me and my team knows, I'm obsessed with Section 38.6. It's the answer. It's the answer to everything. But that is the key point, isn't it? So I think we shouldn't assume that first homes is just going to automatically be acceptable on every site. There is still a planning balance and ultimately a requirement to have the development plan front and centre, regardless of what policy says. Even if we assume it's policy rather than guidance, I guess. That's a discussion that I suspect we haven't heard the end of in the court as to quite how we do that. Thank you. Well, that brings us, we always try to be sort of about 45 minutes, and we are spot on 45 minutes. So well done to both of you for helping keep to time. If I can just sort of thank you, Joe, and you, Peter, for joining me today. As ever, thank everyone for listening in. If you have enjoyed it that much, it will be available online in a few days' time on our YouTube channel, so you can watch again or recommend it to your friends at leisure. And then I just want to make one further thank you. Now, viewers won't necessarily have heard the name Chris Wallace, But Chris is effectively, I don't know if he's our director, our executive producer, or both, but he's the man who has made Outline happen and make the tech work from the outset, really. But sadly, this is his last edition with us, so he's moving on to an exciting new stage in his career. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Chris for being the man behind the scenes who's kept it all going. So thank you to Chris. We will have a break, as is customary, over Easter. So we'll be back in May for the next edition of Outline, when we'll be looking at compulsory purchase and all things CPO related, looking at latest developments and looking at the opportunities and the challenges that are presented when compulsory purchase is used for land assembly and for putting together development sites. So very much hope you're able to join us for that session. But in the meantime, if I can wish everyone a happy Easter and look forward to seeing you all in May. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.